June 1944. Somewhere in the French countryside, just weeks after D-Day, German reconnaissance pilots circled above what appeared to be a massive American armored division preparing for combat. Through the early morning haze, they counted hundreds of tanks clustered near the forest edge, artillery batteries positioned in perfect formation, supply trucks lined up for miles along muddy roads. Anti-aircraft guns pointed skyward. Command tents stood in organized rows. Jeeps moved between positions. Everything looked exactly as it should for a division preparing to push deeper into occupied France. The pilots took photographs, careful to stay high enough to avoid the anti-aircraft fire they assumed would come. They noted grid coordinates, estimated troop strength at roughly 15 to 20,000 men, counted at least 200 armored vehicles. Through their binoculars, they watched soldiers moving between the tanks, performing what looked like maintenance and preparation. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Laundry hung on lines strung between vehicles. All the mundane details that marked a real military encampment. Back at Luftwaffe headquarters, intelligence officers studied the reconnaissance photos with growing concern. The markings on the tanks identified them as belonging to a specific American armored division that had been tracked moving through Normandy. Maps were updated. Pins were moved. German commanders debated where this force would strike next. Should they reinforce the sector? Pull troops from other positions? The debate consumed hours of strategic planning. Artillery was redirected. Panzer reserves were put on alert. Thousands of German soldiers adjusted their positions based on what those photographs showed. Except none of it was real. The tanks were rubber and canvas, inflated like carnival balloons. Each one weighed barely 100 pounds, light enough that 4 men could carry it. The artillery pieces were carved wood and painted metal, incapable of firing a single shell. The trucks were hollow frames covered in fabric. The anti-aircraft guns were props that wouldn't shoot down a paper airplane. And those thousands of soldiers the Germans believed were preparing for battle? Most of them didn't exist at all. Maybe 60 actual men were moving through that camp, creating the illusion of hundreds through constant motion and carefully planned visibility. What the Nazis were staring at through their binoculars and camera lenses was the greatest magic trick ever pulled in wartime, a phantom army designed to fool, deceive, and terrify an enemy that still controlled most of Europe. The men creating this illusion called themselves the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but history would eventually remember them by a more fitting name, the Ghost Army. 1,200 men total in the unit, not battle-hardened infantry or experienced tankers. Artists, designers, sound engineers, radio operators, and actors. Men who before the war had painted in studios, designed sets for Broadway shows, created advertisements for major corporations, and engineered sound for radio broadcasts. Their weapon wasn't bullets or bombs or even traditional military strategy. It was pure illusion, deception elevated to an art form. Lies told so convincingly that an entire army would react to threats that existed only in imagination. Over the next 11 months, from June 1944 until the German surrender in May 1945, this bizarre experimental unit would stage more than 20 major battlefield deceptions across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. They would convince German commanders to move entire divisions based on fabricated intelligence. They would make the enemy abandon strong defensive positions to counterattacks that would never come. They would tie down thousands of German soldiers, hundreds of tanks, and countless artillery pieces, forcing them to fight enemies that didn't exist while real American forces struck elsewhere. The Ghost Army saved thousands of Allied lives by creating elaborate theatrical productions on battlefields where the audience was the enemy and the cost of a bad review was measured in casualties. They operated in absolute secrecy, forbidden from telling anyone, even other American soldiers, what they were really doing. And for decades after the war ended, Nobody outside a small circle of military intelligence officers knew they had existed at all. The men who fought with rubber tanks and sound recordings were sworn to silence, watching history get written without them, their contributions erased by classification stamps and bureaucratic paranoia. But the story of what they accomplished, how a bunch of artists managed to fool one of the most professional military forces in the world, remains one of the most fascinating and bizarre chapters of World War II. This is the story of the men who won battles without firing shots, who defeated enemies with props and recordings, who proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't steel and explosives, but the ability to make your enemy believe a lie. 1989. The Berlin Wall fell. The Cold War ended. Across America, classified documents from World War II started trickling into public archives. Military historians began finding references to units that didn't appear in official histories. Strange budget allocations for equipment that made no sense. Mentions of deception operations with no supporting details. A few persistent researchers started connecting dots. They found scattered references to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, brief mentions in captured German intelligence reports about American units that seemed to be in multiple places at once, photographs in archives showing tanks that, upon close inspection, looked slightly wrong. Too light, shadows not quite right, details that suggested something other than steel and armor. The ghost soldiers, now in their 60s and 70s, started hearing whispers that their story might finally surface. Some were terrified. They'd kept the secret for 45 years. The orders had never been officially rescinded. Speaking out could theoretically still result in prosecution. Others were relieved. Maybe they could finally tell their families the truth before dying. One ghost veteran, a successful graphic designer in Philadelphia, received a call from a military historian in 1991. The historian had found his name on a partial roster and wanted to ask questions. The veteran's hands shook as he held the phone. For 46 years, he'd said nothing. Now, someone was asking directly. "I can't talk about that," he said. Automatically, the response drilled into him. "Sir, I've got declassified documents here that mention your unit. I'm not asking you to reveal secrets. I'm asking you to confirm what's already public." That distinction mattered. If historians had already found the information through official channels, maybe confirmation wouldn't violate his orders. Maybe. He agreed to meet. That meeting changed everything. The historian showed him documents, photographs, after-action reports that had been declassified without fanfare. The ghost veteran stared at papers describing operations he'd participated in, seeing his war in official type for the first time. It was like reading about someone else's life, except it was his. Did this really happen? The historian asked, pointing to an operation near Metz. The veteran's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, all of it. We actually did that." For the next 4 hours, he talked. 46 years of silence poured out in a flood. He described inflating tanks in freezing rain, playing sound recordings while German artillery searched for their position, wearing fake unit patches and drinking in French cafes, deliberately getting seen by potential spies. The fear, the absurdity, the pride in doing something so strange and creative. When he finished, he felt lighter than he had in decades. Then the fear returned. Am I going to get in trouble for this? The historian shook his head. It's been declassified, at least partially. You're confirming historical record, not revealing secrets. But the classification status was murky. Some ghost army operations had been declassified. Others remained classified. The unit's existence was acknowledged, but details were scarce. The veterans existed in a strange limbo, allowed to admit they'd served in the unit, but unclear about what specific details they could share. Word spread through the Ghost Army network. Veterans started cautiously reaching out to each other for the first time in decades. Phone calls between old soldiers who hadn't spoken since 1945. careful conversations, testing boundaries, figuring out what they could say. One ghost soldier tracked down his former commander and called him in 1993. They'd served together in France, inflated hundreds of fake tanks, pulled off deceptions that had fooled entire German divisions. They hadn't spoken in 48 years. "Is it real?" the former enlisted man asked. "Did we actually do that, or have I been remembering it wrong all these years?" The commander laughed, a sound caught between relief and bitterness. It was real, every insane minute of it. They talked for 3 hours, confirming memories, filling in gaps, reconstructing operations from fragmented recollections. When they hung up, both men felt something shift. The isolation of silence was breaking, but frustration grew too. The ghost soldiers were dying. Every year, more funerals, more stories lost. Men who'd done extraordinary things were disappearing with their experiences still classified, still hidden, still unacknowledged. Some veterans became angry. They started demanding full declassification, writing letters to senators, contacting media. One ghost veteran wrote to the Washington Post in 1994, "I'm 73 years old. I did something in the war that helped save American lives. I'd like to tell my grandchildren about it before I die, but my government still considers my service classified. How many of us have to die in silence before someone decides the truth matters more than bureaucracy?" The letter was published. Other ghost veterans saw it and started coming forward. A few brave ones risked speaking to journalists, carefully staying within what they believed was declassified. Articles started appearing in military history magazines. The secret unit that fooled Hitler. Phantom Army, America's classified deception troops. The stories were incomplete, full of gaps and redactions, but they were something. Families were shocked. Children and grandchildren of ghost soldiers read these articles and confronted their relatives. "Is this what you did? You were part of this." One ghost veteran's daughter described her reaction. "My dad had told me he'd been in supply. For 50 years, supply. Then I read this article about inflatable tanks and deception operations and saw his name. I called him crying. 'Why didn't you tell me?' He said, 'I wanted to. Every day for 50 years I wanted to.'" The emotional reunions happened in living rooms across America. Ghost soldiers finally explaining to spouses of 40, 50 years what they'd actually done in the war, showing photographs they'd kept hidden in attic boxes, describing operations they'd carried in silence for half a century. Some families were amazed, proud, astonished their quiet father or grandfather had done something so creative and daring. Others were angry about the deception, the decades of lies, even if the lies had been mandatory. Not everyone wanted the truth revealed. Some ghost veterans preferred the silence. They'd made peace with the secrecy, built lives that didn't include the war, and didn't want it dredged up. When researchers contacted them, they refused to participate. That was a long time ago. I don't see the point in talking about it now. For them, breaking silence meant reopening wounds they'd carefully sealed. They'd spent decades not thinking about the fear, the cold, the close calls, the friends lost to accidents, or the few combat encounters the ghost army couldn't avoid. Silence had been their shield. They didn't want it removed. But the momentum was unstoppable. By the mid-1990s, enough documentation had surfaced that the ghost army story was going public, whether individual veterans cooperated or not. Historians pieced together operations from German records, Allied intelligence reports, and scattered American documents. The full picture emerged slowly, like a photograph developing. In 1996, the Department of Defense officially declassified the Ghost Army's operations. 51 years after the war ended, the veterans were finally allowed to speak freely. Some celebrated. Others felt it was too late. Hundreds of ghost soldiers had already died in silence, taking detailed memories to their graves. The declassification meant surviving veterans could finally talk, but they were talking to a world that had moved on, that barely remembered World War II, that couldn't quite grasp what the Ghost Army had done. "We should have been allowed to tell this story in 1946, one veteran said bitterly. "When it mattered, when people understood the war. Now we're just old men talking about things that sound made up." But historians and younger generations were fascinated. The Ghost Army story had everything: creativity, deception, danger, artistic soldiers using paintbrushes as weapons. It was strange enough to capture imagination, real enough to matter. Documentaries were commissioned, books written. The ghost soldiers, those still alive, suddenly found themselves minor celebrities in military history circles. Men who'd spent 50 years saying they'd done nothing important were now giving interviews, speaking at museums, consulting on historical projects. The attention was overwhelming for some. They'd lived so long in obscurity that sudden recognition felt unreal. One ghost veteran, invited to speak at the National World War II Museum, stood before a crowd of 200 and froze. "For 50 years, I couldn't say a word about this. Now, you want me to talk for an hour?" He laughed nervously. Then he talked for 2 hours, the words pouring out, 5 decades of silence, finally breaking. The Ghost Army saved lives. Historians generally agree. Their deception operations diverted German forces, reduced casualties during crucial operations, and contributed to faster Allied advances. The exact number of lives saved is impossible to calculate, but estimates range from hundreds to thousands. Yet, the men who executed these operations received almost no recognition when it mattered. While other units were celebrated, featured in newsreels, welcomed home with parades and public acknowledgement, the ghost soldiers were told to be quiet. While combat veterans received medals in public ceremonies, Ghost Army commendations were often classified or downplayed. The Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, and commendations they earned came with restrictions about what could be said about why they'd earned them. One ghost soldier received a Bronze Star for actions during Operation Fearson. The citation was deliberately vague, for meritorious service in support of combat operations. It didn't mention that he'd stayed exposed under artillery fire to complete an inflatable tank display that convinced German intelligence an entire armored division was present. His family thought he'd earned the medal for clerical work. The psychological cost of unacknowledged heroism is something researchers are only now beginning to understand. Veterans need to be able to share their experiences, to have their service recognized, to feel that their sacrifice mattered. The ghost soldiers were denied all of that. They watched other veterans form tight-knit communities based on shared units and shared stories. The ghost soldiers couldn't do that. Even acknowledging they'd served together could reveal the unit's existence. They were isolated by classification, unable to bond with fellow veterans or help each other process what they'd experienced. Some developed what psychologists might now recognize as complex trauma responses, not from combat exposure, though they'd experienced some, but from enforced silence. Being unable to speak about a defining life experience for decades creates its own psychological damage. One ghost veteran described it in a 1997 interview. "Imagine doing the most important thing you'll ever do, something that tested everything you were, that you were proud of, that defined you. Then imagine never being able to talk about it to anyone, ever. It's like part of you doesn't exist. Part of your life is classified, so you're only partially real." The career impact was real too. After the war, many ghost soldiers could have leveraged their military experience into better jobs. Officers from celebrated units parlayed their leadership experience into corporate positions. Combat veterans used their service as proof of their courage and capability. The ghost soldiers could do none of that. A Ghost Army officer who'd commanded complex deception operations involving hundreds of men and millions of dollars of equipment couldn't put that on a resume. In job interviews, he had to describe his military service vaguely, making it sound like he'd done nothing significant. He watched, less qualified veterans get positions because they could talk about their war record while his remained classified. The artists faced similar frustrations. Some had used cutting-edge camouflage and deception techniques that would have revolutionized commercial design, but they couldn't reference that work in portfolios. They couldn't explain to clients that they'd mastered visual deception on European battlefields. They had to start their post-war careers as if the previous 3 years had been a blank. Family relationships suffered in subtle ways. Marriages are built on sharing your life with another person. Ghost soldiers couldn't fully share theirs. Even with spouses they trusted completely, they had to keep secrets. That created distance, emotional walls that some marriages never overcame. Children sensed something was off. "My dad never talked about the war," one ghost veteran's son recalled. Other kids' dads would tell stories, but mine would change the subject. "I thought maybe he was ashamed, or maybe he'd done something terrible. I spent years wondering what he was hiding. Turns out he was hiding something amazing, but I didn't learn that until I was in my 40s. The ghost soldiers also lost the chance to shape how their war was understood. The popular narrative of World War II was written by others, emphasized conventional combat, heroic charges, traditional military might. The ghost army story, that sometimes creativity and deception mattered more than firepower, was excluded from that narrative for decades. When they finally could speak, they found themselves fighting against established history. Books had been written, documentaries made, popular understanding solidified, all without the ghost army's perspective. Adding their story meant revising history, which is always harder than writing it correctly the first time. Some ghost veterans became obsessed with correcting the record. They spent their final years giving interviews, writing memoirs, consulting on documentaries, desperate to ensure their story was told before the last of them died. It became a race against time and mortality. Others remained bitter to the end. "They stole 50 years from us," one ghost veteran said shortly before his death in 2003. "We did something extraordinary, and they made us pretend it never happened. Then when we were finally allowed to talk, we were too old for anyone to care. That's what I lost. Not just recognition, but time. The financial cost was real too. Veterans' benefits and pensions are often tied to service records and commendations. Some ghost soldiers had their actual contributions understated in official records because of classification. This affected their veterans' benefits, their disability claims, their pension calculations. They'd done more than their records showed, but they couldn't prove it without revealing classified information. One ghost veteran fought for 20 years to get his disability claim approved. He'd been injured during a deception operation when German artillery hit their position. But the operation was classified, so he couldn't explain how he'd been injured. Without that context, the Army denied his claim, saying his injury wasn't combat-related. He finally won his claim in 1998 after declassification when he was 76 years old. Perhaps the deepest loss was communal memory. Every culture honors its warriors, tells their stories, passes down their deeds to younger generations. The ghost soldiers were excluded from this for half a century. They couldn't tell their children, who couldn't tell their grandchildren. The stories weren't passed down at family gatherings. They weren't shared at veteran halls. They existed only in classified files and fading memories. When declassification finally happened, many of those memories were already gone. Ghost soldiers had died without recording their experiences. Specific operations, individual acts of courage or ingenuity, personal stories that would have enriched the historical record, all lost because the men who lived them died before they could speak. Historians estimate that at least 60% of ghost army veterans died before declassification. 60% of the men who executed these remarkable operations never got to tell their stories publicly. Their families learned the truth only after they were gone, reading about their fathers and grandfathers in books and articles, discovering heroism secondhand. The Ghost Army story shows the hidden cost of classification. Yes, some secrets need to be kept during wartime, but the ghost soldiers kept their secrets for 50 years after the war ended. An entire generation of veterans lived and died in silence, not because revealing their story would endanger national security, but because bureaucracy couldn't be bothered to declassify operations from a war long over. After the war, the ghost soldiers scattered into America's creative industries. They'd been recruited from art schools, advertising agencies, design firms, and Broadway. Now they returned, older, harder, carrying experiences they couldn't discuss. Ellsworth Kelly became one of America's most influential painters, his work defined by bold shapes, precise edges, and plays on perception. He rarely spoke about how he'd spent the war painting shadows on canvas tanks, creating false perspectives to fool German reconnaissance. But you can see it in his work. The obsession with how shapes appear from different angles, the understanding of how the eye can be deceived, the precision required to make two-dimensional surfaces appear three-dimensional. In a rare interview in 1988, Kelly mentioned his Ghost Army service briefly. "I learned about shadow and light in France," he said, "not in art school. On a battlefield, painting camouflage. You learn fast when getting it wrong means people die." His post-war paintings explore those same principles, absent the life-or-death stakes but carrying the knowledge. Bill Blass became one of fashion's most celebrated designers. Before the war, he'd sketched designs for New York fashion houses. During the war, he'd sketched fake insignia and camouflage patterns. He returned to fashion with an understanding of deception, of how appearance creates reality, that most designers never learned. Blass's collections often played with military themes. Structured jackets with precise tailoring. Camouflage patterns reimagined for evening wear. Designs that revealed and concealed simultaneously. Fashion critics praised his sophisticated eye without knowing it had been trained on European battlefields, learning how to make things appear to be what they weren't. He spoke even less about the Ghost Army than Kelly. When asked about his military service, he'd deflect. "I was in Europe, did some design work. Nothing exciting." After declassification, journalists tried to get him to elaborate. He mostly refused. "That was a different life," he said in 1998. "I prefer to let the work speak." But the work did speak. A 2001 retrospective of Blass's career noted recurring themes of duality, disguise, and transformation. The critic wrote, "Blass seemed obsessed with the idea that clothing creates identity, that appearance shapes reality." The critic didn't know about the Ghost Army, about Blass spending a year creating false identities for an entire military unit. Art Kane became one of America's most famous photographers. His iconic image, "A Great Day in Harlem," showing jazz musicians gathered on a New York stoop, is one of the most celebrated photographs in American culture. Kane's eye for composition, for arranging elements to create powerful visual narratives, was honed in the Ghost Army. He'd been part of the visual deception team, arranging fake equipment to look authentic from the air, creating compositions that fooled trained German photo analysts. After the war, he brought that precision to photography. Every element carefully placed, nothing accidental, every visual detail contributing to the larger story. Kane spoke more openly about the Ghost Army than many veterans, giving interviews after declassification. "We were creating photographs, essentially," he explained in 1997, "arranging elements so that when the Germans photographed them from above, they'd see what we wanted them to see. That's photography, controlling what the viewer perceives." Not all ghost artists achieve fame. Hundreds returned to quiet careers in commercial art, graphic design, advertising. But they carried the same experiences, the same secret knowledge about deception and perception. One ghost veteran became an advertising copywriter in Detroit. For 30 years, he crafted campaigns selling cars, appliances, and consumer goods. He was good at it, understanding instinctively how to shape perception, how to make people believe they needed things they didn't. After retirement, he admitted the connection. Advertising is deception, just without the stakes. In the war, we made the Germans see phantom armies. In advertising, we made Americans see phantom needs. Same principles, just nobody dies. The artists who'd worked on sonic deception went into audio engineering, radio production, film sound design. They'd learned how sound creates reality, how you can make someone believe they're hearing one thing when they're hearing something else entirely. One Ghost Army sound engineer worked on Hollywood films for 40 years, creating audio landscapes that transported audiences. He never told colleagues he'd learned his craft, making German listening posts believe they were hearing American tank columns. Teaching became another common path. Ghost Army veterans taught art, design, photography, advertising at universities across America. They passed down techniques without explaining where they'd learned them. Students absorbed lessons about perspective, light, shadow, and visual deception that had been developed to fool Nazi intelligence. One Ghost veteran taught graphic design at a California college for 25 years. His students remembered him as demanding, obsessed with precision. He'd make us redo projects if shadows fell wrong, one student recalled. He said, if you're creating an illusion, it has to be perfect or it falls apart. We thought he was being difficult. We didn't know he'd learned that lesson when mistakes meant American soldiers died. The Ghost artists also struggled with art that felt trivial after the war. They'd use creative skills for stakes that mattered absolutely. People lived or died based on whether their deceptions worked. Returning to commercial art, where the stakes were product sales or client satisfaction, felt hollow. A Ghost Army painter who'd done gallery work before the war tried to return to it afterward. He painted abstract pieces, landscapes, still lives, but he found it meaningless. In the war, my painting mattered, he wrote in his journal in 1949. Every brushstroke had purpose, creating shadows that would fool German analysis. Now I paint, and it's just decoration. I can't make myself care. He eventually stopped painting entirely, taking a job as an art director for a publishing house. At least there, design served a purpose, even if it was just selling books rather than saving lives. Others went the opposite direction, throwing themselves into art precisely because it didn't matter. After years of high-stakes deception, creating art purely for beauty or expression felt liberating. No lives depending on getting the shadow angle correct. No German intelligence to fool. Just paint and canvas and freedom. One Ghost sculptor described this feeling in a 1999 interview. After the war, I made abstract sculptures. Wild, chaotic things that made no logical sense. Critics called them revolutionary. Really, I was just relieved to make something that didn't have to fool anyone. That could be exactly what it appeared to be. After years of deception, honesty felt radical. The war changed how these artists saw their work fundamentally. They understood, more deeply than most, that all art is manipulation of perception. Painting creates the illusion of 3 dimensions on 2-dimensional surfaces. Photography selects and frames reality. Design guides the eye where the artist wants it to go. These are forms of benign deception, and the Ghost artists had learned them at the highest possible level. Some felt guilty about using these skills commercially. They'd employed their talents to help win a war against fascism. Now they were using the same talents to sell cigarettes or design album covers. The dissonance troubled them. A Ghost Army designer who went into advertising wrote in a letter to a fellow veteran in 1967, "We used to trick Nazis. Now I trick housewives into buying detergent. I know which felt more worthwhile. Sometimes I wonder if we wasted everything we learned, but others found meaning in applying their skills to peaceful purposes." After using creativity for war, using it for beauty or commerce or communication felt like redemption. One ghost veteran who became an industrial designer said, "In the war, I designed fake guns. After the war, I designed real furniture. Both required the same skills, but only one made people's lives better. I'm glad I got to do both." The ghost artists also found each other eventually. After declassification, some organized informal reunions, not official military gatherings, but meetups of artists who'd shared a strange war. They'd show each other their post-war work, pointing out influences and techniques that trace back to Europe. "You can see it in all our work," one said at a 2002 gathering. "The understanding that reality is constructed, that what people see depends on how you present it. We all learned that the same way on battlefields, making the Germans see armies that didn't exist. It's in everything we made afterward." The Ghost Army's artistic legacy is scattered across American culture. In paintings hanging in major museums, in iconic photographs reproduced endlessly, in fashion designs that influenced decades of style, in advertisements that shaped American consumer culture, in films, television, graphic design, architecture. Most people who encounter this work have no idea it was created by veterans of a classified deception unit. The connections are invisible, just like the Ghost Army once was. But they're there, woven into American art by soldiers who learned their craft fooling Nazis, and then spent the rest of their lives applying those skills to a world at peace. The artists returned from war changed, carrying secret knowledge they couldn't share, using skills they couldn't explain. They made America's post-war culture richer, stranger, more sophisticated. And for 50 years, almost nobody knew why. After the war, Allied intelligence interviewed thousands of captured German officers, documenting their perspectives on operations, tactics, and intelligence failures. Buried in these transcripts are references to the Ghost Army, moments where German officers describe being deceived without knowing the full truth of how it happened. A Panzer Division commander, interrogated in June 1945, described the Rhine crossing operation. "We received intelligence that American forces were massing near Viersen. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed significant armor concentrations. We repositioned 2 battalions to counter the expected assault. Then we learned the main crossing occurred elsewhere. By the time we redeployed, it was too late. I still don't understand the intelligence failure." He never learned there was no intelligence failure. The intelligence was perfect. The Germans had accurately identified where they saw American forces. Those forces just happened to be rubber and canvas. Another officer, questioned about operations in France in October 1944, said, "We tracked an American armored division moving into position near our lines. Radio intercepts confirmed their presence. Then they vanished. Completely. We searched for days. Found nothing. I assumed they'd withdrawn, but then they appeared 50 miles away. How do you move an entire division without detection? The answer, you don't move them. You deflate them and pack them on trucks." The German transcripts reveal how completely the deception worked. These weren't low-level soldiers being fooled. These were intelligence officers, experienced commanders, trained analysts. They believed absolutely that they were tracking real American units because the Ghost Army's deceptions hit every intelligence gathering method simultaneously. Visual reconnaissance saw tanks and artillery. Radio intercepts heard unit communications. Human intelligence from spies reported seeing American soldiers with specific unit patches. Sound detection picked up tank movements. Every intelligence stream confirmed the others. The deception was perfectly layered. One German intelligence analyst, interviewed in 1946, described his frustration. "We had photographs, radio intercepts, scout reports, all indicating American positions. We weren't guessing. We had multiple confirmed sources, but repeatedly, when we acted on this intelligence, the Americans weren't where we knew they were. I began to distrust our own information. I wondered if there was a fundamental flaw in our intelligence gathering. There was no flaw. His intelligence gathering was excellent. He just didn't account for the possibility that an entire enemy division could be fictional. The psychological impact on German intelligence officers was significant. After several Ghost Army operations, some became paranoid. They started doubting all intelligence, even when it was accurate. If American units could appear and disappear, could teleport across France, could be in multiple places simultaneously, how could any intelligence be trusted? This paranoia helped the Allies beyond the Ghost Army's specific operations. German officers became hesitant, second-guessing their information, delaying responses. The Ghost Army's deceptions created a broader climate of uncertainty that benefited all Allied operations. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance officer described this in a 1947 interview. After several incidents where our photo analysis was apparently wrong, we began assuming American deception was everywhere. We discounted real intelligence because we thought it might be fake. In trying to avoid being fooled, we fooled ourselves. Some German officers figured out something was wrong, even if they didn't understand exactly what. A Wehrmacht intelligence colonel interrogated in May 1945 said, "The Americans were doing something with their deployments that we couldn't understand. Units appeared too quickly, disappeared too completely. The movements didn't make logistical sense. I suspected some form of deception, but couldn't determine the method." He got close to the truth, but couldn't quite grasp it. His mind couldn't make the leap to inflatable tanks. The concept was too absurd, too theatrical. German military culture didn't think in those terms. One captured document, a German intelligence assessment from March 1945, noted American force deployment patterns suggest possible deception operations, recommend increased scrutiny of reconnaissance data, but the recommendations were vague. They knew something was off, but couldn't identify what. The Ghost Army exploited a blind spot in German thinking. The Wehrmacht was sophisticated, professional, experienced, but they thought conventionally. They understood camouflage, misdirection, feints. They didn't imagine an enemy would stage elaborate theatrical productions with props and sound effects. A German general, interviewed in 1948 after years in POW camps, admitted, "If you had told me during the war that Americans were using inflatable tanks to deceive us, I would have laughed. It sounds like a joke, like something from a comedy film. But apparently it worked. We were looking for conventional military deception and missed something unconventional." The transcripts also reveal German respect for the operation once they learned about it. After the Ghost Army was mentioned in some historical accounts in 1970s, researchers tracked down surviving German officers who'd been fooled. One former Panzer commander said in a 1977 interview, "When I learned about the inflatable tanks, my first reaction was anger. We'd been made to look foolish. But then I felt something like admiration. It was creative, audacious, effective. Very un-German in its approach, which is probably why we fell for it." Another veteran, speaking in 1985, said, "The Americans understood something we didn't. That modern warfare includes information warfare, psychological warfare. They fought our minds as much as our divisions. We were still thinking about armor thickness and gun caliber while they were staging theater productions. They were ahead of us in ways we didn't recognize." Some German veterans were bitter. They felt the Ghost Army's deception was somehow dishonorable, not proper warfare. One officer interviewed in 1992 said, "We fought honestly. They fought with tricks. Yes, it worked, but it wasn't soldiering. It was showmanship." But most acknowledge the legitimacy. War is deception. Sun Tzu wrote it thousands of years ago. The Ghost Army just took the principle further than most armies imagined possible. The German perspective on the Ghost Army reveals how completely unconventional the operation was. Even after being fooled, even after learning how it was done, German officers struggled to wrap their minds around it. The idea that artists and designers, armed with rubber and paint, could be more effective than tanks and guns challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare. One fascinating transcript from 1950 captures a conversation between former German and American officers at a military symposium. The German asks how the inflatable tanks were made. The American Ghost veteran explains the construction process. The German listens, then says, "But surely our reconnaissance pilots would notice the difference?" The American replies, "They didn't. Your pilots photographed them hundreds of times. Your photo analysts studied those images. Nobody caught it." Long silence in the transcript. Then the German, "I don't know whether to be impressed with your creativity or horrified at our blindness." The American, "Both are appropriate." These transcripts show that the Ghost Army's victory wasn't just tactical. It was conceptual. They won by thinking differently, by approaching war as theater, by understanding that perception creates reality. The Germans, for all their military sophistication, couldn't defend against an attack that came from a completely unexpected direction. By the early 2000s, the Ghost Army veterans were disappearing fast. Men who'd been in their early 20s during the war were now in their 80s. Every month brought more funerals, more stories lost, more memories erased. Historians and documentarians launched urgent efforts to record as many Ghost Army veterans as possible before they were all gone. Interview projects, oral histories, desperate attempts to preserve first-hand accounts while any first-hand witnesses remained. One filmmaker, working on a Ghost Army documentary in 2005, described the pressure. "Every time I scheduled an interview, I worried the veteran wouldn't live long enough for us to meet. I'd call to confirm, and family members would say he'd just died. We were literally racing mortality." The surviving Ghost soldiers felt this urgency too. Many became determined to tell their stories before time ran out. Men who'd been reluctant to discuss the war suddenly opened up. Understanding this was their last chance to ensure the truth survived them. Rick Baer, documenting the Ghost Army in the mid-2000s, interviewed dozens of veterans. He noticed a pattern. They all said some version of the same thing. "I'm glad I can finally talk about this before I die." There was relief, but also sadness. Sadness for all the guys who never got to tell their stories. The reunions became especially poignant. The Ghost Army veterans started organizing annual gatherings in the early 2000s. Each year, fewer attended. Empty chairs multiplied. Names read during memorial portions of the program grew longer. At the 2008 reunion, only 43 Ghost Army veterans attended out of the 1,200 who'd served. They were the last witnesses to operations that had changed the course of battles, saved unknown numbers of lives, and demonstrated creativity's power in warfare. One veteran, attending what would be his final reunion, looked around the room and said, "We used to fill this whole hotel. Now, we barely fill this one room. In a few years, there won't be anyone left who remembers what we actually did." The urgency extended to official recognition. For decades, the Ghost Army had been ignored by the military establishment. Now, with veterans dying, advocates pushed for formal acknowledgement. In 2013, bills were introduced in Congress to award the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, one of America's highest civilian honors. Supporters argued the unit deserved recognition for extraordinary service. Opponents questioned whether deception operations warranted such prestigious acknowledgement. The bill stalled. Years passed. More Ghost veterans died. By 2019, fewer than a dozen Ghost Army veterans were still alive. The average age was 95. Each was a walking archive of irreplaceable knowledge. When they died, crucial details of operations would die with them. The Congressional Gold Medal campaign intensified. Advocates argued this was the last chance to honor these men while any lived. Family members of deceased ghost soldiers testified before Congress, sharing their father's and grandfather stories. One daughter testified, "My father helped change the course of the war. He saved lives through creativity and courage. He died in 2014 without ever receiving proper recognition. Please don't let the last of his comrades die the same way." In 2024, Congress finally passed the legislation. The Ghost Army would receive the Congressional Gold Medal. But by then, only a handful of veterans survived to see it. Most had died, waiting for recognition that came decades too late. Bernie Bluestein, one of the last surviving Ghost Army soldiers, said at age 99, "I'm grateful we're finally being honored. But I wish my friends who died 20-30 years ago could have seen this. They deserved it more than I do." The race against time wasn't just about official recognition. It was about preserving knowledge. The Ghost Army had developed techniques that remain relevant to modern military deception. But those techniques existed primarily in the memories of men born in the 1920s. Military historians worked to document everything they could. Technical details about how the inflatable equipment was constructed. Tactical doctrine about how deception operations were planned and executed. Personal experiences that brought the history alive. Some details were lost forever. Operations that only one or two men knew the full details of, and those men died before being interviewed. Specific techniques that were never written down. Stories that died in nursing homes and hospitals before anyone thought to ask. One researcher described the frustration. "I'd find a reference to an operation in documents, then discover the only veteran who'd been there died 2 years earlier. We're trying to reconstruct history from fragments, interviewing the last witnesses who remember pieces, but not the whole picture." The Ghost Army's art became crucial to preservation. The paintings, sketches, and drawings these artist soldiers created during and after the war documented what photographs couldn't. They showed how the deception looked, felt, and functioned. Museums began collecting this art urgently. The National World War II Museum, the Smithsonian, and other institutions sought out Ghost Army artwork before it was lost or destroyed. Some families didn't realize what they had. Paintings stacked in attics showing inflatable tanks and deception operations, historically invaluable, nearly thrown away during estate sales. By 2020, COVID-19 added another threat. The remaining Ghost Army veterans, all in their mid to late 90s, were in the highest risk category. Historians worried the pandemic would kill the last witnesses before their stories were fully recorded. Interviews moved to Zoom and phone calls. Some veterans were too frail for even that. A few died of COVID, taking their memories with them. One of the last Ghost Army veterans died in April 2020 at age 97. His family held a small funeral over video chat. Nobody could gather to honor him properly. The survivors carry a unique burden. They're the last living links to operations that most of the world only learned about 2 decades ago. They field questions from historians, students, documentarians, family members, all trying to understand what the Ghost Army did and how they did it. One of the final surviving members, interviewed in 2023 at age 98, said, "I'm tired. I've told these stories hundreds of times now, but I keep telling them because once I'm gone, there won't be anyone left who was there. These stories will just be words in books. They won't have a voice anymore." That's the race, not just against death, but against the transition from living memory to history. While Ghost Army veterans live, the stories have texture, emotion, first-hand authority. When they're gone, the Ghost Army becomes just another historical footnote, fascinating but distant. The last reunion was planned for 2024. Only 5 veterans were expected to attend, out of 1,200 who served. The organizers debated whether to continue having reunions at all with so few left. They decided yes. Even if only one veteran attended, Even if none did, and it was just family members, the gathering would continue. The Ghost Army story deserved to be remembered, celebrated, and kept alive even after the last ghost faded. Every modern military has deception units now. They use drones, electronic warfare, cyber operations, but the fundamental concept traces directly to the Ghost Army. Make the enemy see what isn't there. Make them waste resources fighting phantoms. Win through confusion rather than confrontation. The U.S. military's contemporary deception doctrine cites the Ghost Army explicitly. Training materials at Fort Huachuca, where military intelligence specialists are trained, include case studies of Ghost Army operations. Officers study how 1,200 men with inflatable tanks achieved what entire divisions couldn't. Modern inflatable decoys are far more sophisticated than the canvas and rubber versions from 1944, but the principle is identical. The U.S. Army currently deploys inflatable versions of tanks, helicopters, and artillery. They include radar reflectors that make them appear genuine to enemy sensors, thermal elements that mimic heat signatures, electronic systems that simulate radio emissions. During the Gulf War, coalition forces used inflatable decoys extensively. Iraqi forces wasted significant ammunition striking fake positions while real assets maneuvered safely. The tactic worked exactly as it had 50 years earlier in France. A military deception planner interviewed about modern techniques said, "Everything we do builds on what the Ghost Army proved, that with the right combination of visual, audio, and electronic deception, you can make the enemy completely misread the battlefield. We have better technology, but they had the core insight." Electronic warfare took the Ghost Army's radio deception to exponentially more sophisticated levels. Modern military units can create entirely fictional enemy forces on radar screens, fake radio networks that simulate battalion-level communications, electronic signatures that make one aircraft appear to be 20. The sonic deception concept evolved too. Modern military forces use directional audio systems that can project sound with precision, making enemy forces believe they're being flanked by armor that doesn't exist. The principle is identical to the Ghost Army's sound trucks, just executed with digital technology instead of vinyl recordings. Cyber warfare represents the newest evolution of Ghost Army tactics, creating fake military installations that exist only in satellite imagery databases, manipulating enemy intelligence networks to inject false information, building phantom order of battle data that makes opposing forces misjudge strength and positions. A NSA veteran speaking at a 2018 intelligence conference said, "The Ghost Army fought the information war before it was called that. They understood that controlling the enemy's perception was as important as controlling terrain. Every cyber operation we run today is built on that foundation. But the legacy goes beyond tactics. The Ghost Army proved that warfare requires creative thinking, that unconventional approaches can be more effective than conventional ones, that diverse skills matter on battlefields. Modern military recruitment emphasizes this. The Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines all actively recruit specialists with backgrounds in art, design, communications, technology, and psychology. They're looking for people who can think creatively about problems. Exactly what the Ghost Army demonstrated was valuable. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, runs programs exploring deception and cognitive warfare that directly descend from Ghost Army concepts. How do you make enemy decision-makers believe false information? How do you create layered deceptions that survive scrutiny? How do you execute theater-level deception in the digital age? One DARPA program manager explained, "The Ghost Army showed that warfare is ultimately about psychology. You're not just fighting the enemy's forces. You're fighting their perception, their decision-making, their understanding of reality. Every advanced military in the world now has units dedicated to that mission. International militaries studied the Ghost Army too. British, French, Israeli, Russian, and Chinese forces all developed deception doctrines influenced by the declassified Ghost Army operations. The techniques spread globally, becoming standard military practice. Interestingly, the Ghost Army's influence extends into private sector security. Corporate intelligence, competitive analysis, and information security all borrowed concepts from military deception. The idea that you can defend by misdirecting threats, that making adversaries waste resources on phantom targets is cheaper than direct defense, moved from battlefields to boardrooms. One cybersecurity firm uses deception technology that creates fake network assets for hackers to attack. While hackers waste time penetrating fictional servers, security teams track and counter them. It's the digital equivalent of inflatable tanks, and the company's founder explicitly cited the Ghost Army as inspiration. The Ghost Army's greatest legacy might be conceptual. They proved that wars aren't won just by the side with better weapons, more soldiers, or stronger economies. Wars are won by the side that thinks more creatively, that questions assumptions, that finds unexpected solutions to impossible problems. This lesson resonated far beyond military circles. Business strategists, political campaigners, social movements all absorbed variations of the Ghost Army's insight. Perception shapes reality, and those who control perception have power. One management consultant teaching corporate strategy said, "I use Ghost Army case studies with Fortune 500 executives. The lessons about creative problem solving, about achieving objectives through misdirection rather than direct confrontation, about using unconventional resources effectively, those apply to any competitive situation." Education absorbed the lessons too. Military academies, business schools, design programs, and communication courses all teach Ghost Army operations as examples of innovative thinking under pressure. Students learn how artists became warriors, how rubber and canvas defeated steel and armor, how 1,200 creative people accomplished what conventional forces couldn't. The story inspires people to think differently about their own challenges and constraints. Perhaps most importantly, the Ghost Army legacy validates the importance of art, creativity, and unconventional thinking in spheres traditionally dominated by conventional approaches. You don't have to be the strongest, the most well-armed, or the most numerous to succeed. Sometimes creativity beats firepower. Every inflatable decoy deployed in Ukraine, every electronic deception operation run in the Middle East, every military doctrine that emphasizes psychological operations over kinetic strikes, every recruitment poster seeking creative thinkers for military service.